The organ music stopped, not a gentle fade, but a jarring, discordant crash. Hundreds of high society guests held their breath as the groom took 3 trembling steps back from the altar. "I can't do this," he whispered, leaving his bride frozen in white silk. The humiliation was absolute, the silence deafening. But before the first tear could even form in her eyes, the chapel temperature plummeted to freezing. A man with eyes like crushed velvet and a predator's grace detached himself from the shadows of the apse. His voice, dark and velvet smooth, echoed through the terrified room. "Then she's mine." The afternoon sun poured through the stained-glass windows of the Cathedral of St. Jude in downtown Boston, casting fractured prisms of ruby and sapphire across the marble floor. Vivian Kensington stood at the back of the nave, her hands gripping a bouquet of white peonies so tightly her knuckles were translucent. This was supposed to be the defining moment of her life. The Kensington family name, once synonymous with New England aristocracy, had been quietly bleeding money for a decade. This wedding to Preston Carmichael, heir to the Carmichael shipping empire, was the tourniquet that would save them all. Vivian's father, Harrison Kensington, patted her hand, where it rested in the crook of his arm. "Breathe, Vivi," he murmured, his voice tight with a mixture of pride and profound relief. "Everything is perfect." And it looked perfect. The cathedral was packed with 400 of the city's most influential figures, senators, tech billionaires, and old-money matriarchs in their Chanel tweeds. The scent of thousands of imported Casablanca lilies was heavy, almost cloying in the warm June air. The string quartet in the loft transitioned smoothly into Pachelbel's canon, signaling their cue. Vivian forced a radiant smile, the heavy silk of her custom Vera Wang gown sweeping against the stone as the grand oak doors opened. She began the long walk down the aisle. At the end of that aisle stood Preston. He was handsome, in a predictable country club sort of way. Sandy blonde hair, a tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, a sharp jawline. But as Vivian drew closer, her smile began to falter. Preston didn't look like a man about to greet his bride. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad. His skin was entirely devoid of color, taking on a sickly, ashen hue. A sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, catching the light of the altar candles. His hands were clasped in front of him, but they were shaking violently. Vivian's heart gave a strange, uneven thud. Just nerves, she told herself. Just the pressure of the crowd. When Harrison finally handed her over, kissing her cheek before stepping back, Vivian reached out to take Preston's hands. He flinched. It was a small movement, but in front of 400 people watching their every breath, it might as well have been a gunshot. Vivian's hands hung suspended in the empty air between them. "Preston," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the quiet hum of the congregation. "Are you all right?" Preston swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically around the room, specifically avoiding her gaze. He looked toward the deep-shadowed alcoves near the confessionals, his chest heaving as if he couldn't draw enough oxygen. Then he looked at Vivian, not with love, not even with apology. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated terror. "I can't," he choked out. The efficient Archbishop Miller leaned in, his brow furrowed. "Son, are you unwell?" "I can't do this," Preston said, his voice rising, cracking under the strain. He took a step backward, his polished dress shoes scraping loudly against the marble. A collective gasp swept through the pews. It started in the front rows, the Carmichaels and the Kensingtons, and rippled backward like a wave. Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. The heavy corset of her gown suddenly felt like an iron maiden crushing her ribs. "Preston, please," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. "Whatever it is, we can talk about it. Don't do this here. You don't understand?" Preston stammered, backing up another step, nearly tripping over the edge of the altar steps. I thought I could go through with it, but if I marry you, they'll kill me. He'll kill me." "Who?" Harrison Kensington demanded, stepping out of the front pew, his face flushed with sudden violent anger. "Preston, what in God's name is the meaning of this? You are humiliating my daughter." Preston didn't answer. He turned his back on Vivian, practically scrambling down the side steps of the altar. He was fleeing. The groom was actually running away. The string quartet, confused by the commotion, abruptly stopped playing. The silence that followed was horrifying. Vivian stood completely alone at the center of the massive, ornate altar, a bride abandoned in front of the entire world. The whispers began hissing venomous little sounds from the pews. Bankrupt, scandal, ruined. Tears burned the backs of Vivian's eyes, but a sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere stopped them from falling. The heavy, lily-scented warmth of the cathedral vanished in a microsecond. It wasn't a draft. It was a violent, unnatural plunge in temperature that caused the breath of the front-row guests to plume white in the air. The hundreds of flickering candles illuminating the altar simultaneously dimmed their flames, turning a strange, unnatural shade of icy blue. The stained-glass windows seemed to darken, as if a massive cloud had just blotted out the June sun. The whispering died instantly. A primal, suffocating dread settled over the room. It was the kind of fear that prey feels when a predator enters the clearing, an instinctual biological imperative to freeze. From the darkest corner of the apse, where the shadows pooled thickest behind the marble pillars, footsteps echoed. Click, click, click. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud in the absolute silence. Every head in the cathedral turned. Even Preston, halfway down the side aisle, froze in his tracks, letting out a pathetic whimpering sound. A man stepped into the dim light of the altar. He was devastatingly beautiful, but it was an aggressive, terrifying beauty. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke suit of midnight wool that seemed to absorb the light around him. His hair was dark, as a raven's wing swept back from a face that looked like it had been carved from cold marble by an angry god. But it was his eyes that arrested the room. They were a deep, mesmerizing shade of crimson-flecked brown, like old, dried blood catching the light. It was Caspian Vane. Vivian recognized him instantly, though they had never formally met. Few had. Caspian Vane was a ghost in the corporate world, a billionaire venture capitalist whose firm, Vane Syndicate, owned half the real estate in Boston and had its fingers in global shipping pharmaceuticals and private security. He was a man of myth and ruthlessness, but the rumors whispered in the darkest, most intoxicated corners of high society hinted at something else, something ancient, something monstrous. He moved with a fluid, liquid grace that no human possessed, closing the distance to the altar in a matter of seconds. As he passed, Preston Caspian didn't even turn his head, but Preston dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands, trembling uncontrollably. Caspian ascended the altar steps. Archbishop Miller stumbled backward, clutching his silver crucifix so tightly his hands bled, his lips moving in a frantic, silent prayer. Caspian stopped 3 feet from Vivian. The cold radiating from his body was intense, carrying the scent of ozone-crushed winter pine and a metallic tang that made her mouth water and her stomach clench. "He is a coward," Caspian said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that bypassed Vivian's ears and vibrated directly in her chest. "A pathetic, sniveling little boy who plays with debts he cannot afford to pay." Vivian couldn't speak. She was caught in his gaze, paralyzed, not just by the supernatural aura radiating from him, but by the raw, crackling intensity in his eyes. What are you doing here?" Harrison Kensington finally managed to stammer, though he didn't dare step closer. "Mr. Vane, this is a private ceremony." Caspian slowly turned his head to look at Vivian's father. The look was so dismissive, so utterly devoid of mortal empathy, that Harrison silenced himself instantly. Caspian turned his attention back to Vivian. He looked at the white silk of her dress, the trembling of her bare shoulders, and finally the singular tear that had managed to escape and track down her cheek. Slowly he raised a hand. His fingers were adorned with a single heavy silver signet ring bearing a wolf crest. He brushed the tear away with his thumb. His skin was freezing like touching dry ice, but where it met her skin, a jolt of pure electric heat shot through her veins. "You deserve a king, Vivian," Caspian murmured softly, so only she could hear. Then he turned to face the congregation. His voice boomed rich and terrifying. "The boy refuses his prize," Caspian declared, his gaze locking onto the cowering Preston. "He breaks his contract. Therefore his forfeit is collected. I am calling his debt due." Caspian turned back to Vivian, holding out his hand. His palm was broad, his fingers long and elegant. "Then she's mine. Pandemonium erupted, but it was a muted, suffocated kind of chaos. Women gasped, men stood up from their pews, but no one dared cross the threshold of the altar. The invisible pressure in the room kept them pinned to their spots. "You're insane," Vivian whispered, finally finding her voice. It was raspy, breathless. "I am not a piece of property. I don't belong to him, and I certainly don't belong to you." Caspian's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smirk. He didn't lower his hand. "Oh, my fierce little bird, you are entirely correct. You belong to no one, but your family's legacy, the Kensington estate, the millions your father embezzled from my offshore accounts to keep up the appearance of wealth." Vivian's breath caught. She whipped her head to look at her father. Harrison was pale as a ghost, gripping the back of the front pew, refusing to meet her eyes. Her mother Beatrice had her hand clamped over her mouth, weeping silently. "It's true," Caspian said smoothly, stepping an inch closer. The cold enveloped her, oddly soothing against the flush of her humiliation. "Your father stole from the Vane Syndicate, a fatal error. To pay me back, he brokered a deal with the Carmichael family. Preston would marry you, the Carmichael money would quietly replace my stolen funds, and I would allow your father to keep his head attached to his shoulders." Vivian felt the floor tilting beneath her. The world was spinning. Her entire life, this marriage, the desperate pleas of her parents. It was all a transaction to save her father from the wrath of a vampire lord. But Preston Caspian continued, his voice dripping with venom, discovered exactly what he was dealing with. He discovered what I am, and he realized that tying his family to the Kensington debt meant putting his own neck on the line, so he ran. "Why are you doing this?" Vivian asked, her voice shaking, staring at the imposing immortal before her. "If they owe you money, take their money. Take the houses. Leave me out of this. I have no use for human money, Vivian. I have more wealth than God." Caspian said, his dark eyes tracing the line of her throat. Vivian felt a primitive spike of adrenaline at his stare. "I deal in loyalty. I deal in blood. Your father offered you as collateral, and since Preston has defaulted, the collateral belongs to the bank." He leaned in closer. His lips were mere inches from her ear. "But I am offering you a choice, a luxury your father never gave you." Caspian pulled back just enough to hold her gaze. "Walk down that aisle alone. Walk out of this cathedral. By midnight, the Kensington name will be eradicated. Your father will go to federal prison, or perhaps I'll simply let my associates handle him. You will be penniless, disgraced, the laughing stock of this city." He gestured to his still outstretched hand. "Or you take my hand. You leave this chapel on my arm. You become my bride, my consort under the laws of my kind. You will be feared, you will be untouchable, and your family's pathetic little debts will be erased." Vivian stared at his hand. The silver ring gleamed in the blue candlelight. She looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the wealthy elite who had come to judge her. She saw Preston still cowering on the floor like a beaten dog. She saw her father, a weak, deceitful man who had sold her to save his own skin. If she walked away, she would be ruined, but more than that, she would be a victim. She looked back up into Caspian Vane's ancient predator eyes. There was no warmth there, but there was no deceit either. It was a cold, brutal honesty. He was a monster, yes, but at least he wasn't a coward. "If I do this," Vivian said, her chin lifting defiantly, the fire returning to her veins, "I am not your servant. I am not a pet you acquired to settle a ledger." Caspian's eyes flared with a sudden dangerous heat. The smirk vanished, replaced by a look of intense predatory intrigue. "I do not take pets, Vivian. I take queens." Slowly, deliberately, Vivian raised her hand. The heavy lace of her sleeve slid down as she placed her warm, trembling palm into his freezing grasp. The moment their skin connected, a shockwave of energy rippled through the chapel. The blue candles flared violently, sending sparks into the air before snapping back to their natural warm yellow light. The freezing temperature dissipated instantly, replaced by a rush of warm summer air. Caspian's grip was unyielding. He pulled her flush against his chest, looping her arm through his. Archbishop Caspian commanded without looking back, "The ceremony is concluded." Together, the vampire king and his new bride turned their backs on the altar. They walked down the long, red-carpeted aisle, their steps perfectly synchronized. The congregation parted like the Red Sea three pulling back into the pews, terrified to even let the hem of Vivian's dress brush their shoes. As they walked past, Preston Caspian paused for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the former groom. "Run, little boy," Caspian whispered, his voice slicing through the silence. "Because tonight the hunt begins." Vivian held her head high, her knuckles white as she gripped Caspian's arm, stepping out of the heavy oak doors of the cathedral and into a dangerous, bloody new world. The heavy armored door of the midnight black Mercedes Maybach Pullman closed with a solid, echoing thud, instantly severing the chaotic roar of the cathedral courtyard. Inside the extended cabin, the silence was absolute, save for the faint, expensive hum of the engine and the subtle rush of climate control. Vivienne collapsed against the quilted white leather, the adrenaline that had carried her down the aisle finally vaporizing. Her custom Vera Wang gown, previously a symbol of her family's salvation, now felt like a shroud of spun sugar, beautiful, fragile, and utterly useless. She stared at her own reflection in the heavily tinted privacy glass. The June sun beat down on the streets of Boston outside, illuminating the panicked faces of the paparazzi who had gathered on the cathedral steps, their camera flashes bouncing harmlessly off the Maybach's bulletproof exterior. Caspian Vane sat opposite her, an impenetrable fortress of dark wool and dangerous composure. He reached over to the polished, burled walnut console, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a heavy baccarat tumbler. It was Macallan 25, the rich, peaty scent cutting through the residual smell of lilies and fear clinging to Vivian's skin. "Drink," Caspian commanded softly, offering her the glass. Vivienne didn't move. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Are you going to kidnap me, Mr. Vane? Is this the part where I disappear into some subterranean dungeon because my father is a thief?" Caspian's lips twitched in a fleeting, terrifying approximation of a smile. He set the glass down on the console between them. "If I wanted to lock you in a dungeon, Vivian, I would not have claimed you in front of the Archbishop of Boston, the mayor, and 3 sitting U.S. senators. You are not a hostage. You are my wife, or you will be once the sun sets." "We are not married," Vivian snapped, her voice trembling but edged with defiance. "A theatrical stunt at an altar does not constitute a legal binding in the state of Massachusetts." "The state of Massachusetts," Caspian murmured, leaning back and crossing one long leg over the other, "operates under the illusion that it governs this city. I assure you, my laws supersede theirs, and under the laws of the syndicate, our verbal contract in a sacred space, witnessed by hundreds, is binding." He tapped a button on the armrests, and the opaque partition separating them from the driver lowered slightly. "Take Storrow Drive, head to the Brookline estate," he instructed before the glass silently glided back up. The Maybach pulled away from the curb, smoothly gliding toward the Charles River. "You said Preston discovered what you are?" Vivian said, her analytical mind struggling to grasp the supernatural reality sitting less than 3 feet away from her. "Vampires? It sounds absurd, like a plot out of a cheap paperback. Yet, with the temperature in that church, your eyes—" "I am as real as the debt your father owes me, little bird," Caspian replied. "But Preston Carmichael's cowardice runs much deeper than mere stage fright or a sudden fear of the dark. Do you know why he really ran?" Vivian shook her head, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "The Carmichael shipping empire has been secretly ferrying cargo for a rival faction, the Volkov cartel out of New York. The Volkovs are old, brutal, and very territorial," Caspian explained, his tone shifting into something dangerously sharp. "Preston discovered that your father had embezzled my funds, and he also discovered my true nature. Instead of marrying you and using his family's money to pay me off quietly, the little fool panicked. He went to the Volkovs." Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "He sold us out. He offered the Volkovs the Carmichael shipping routes in perpetuity in exchange for their protection against me," Caspian said, his jaw tightening, the crimson flecks in his eyes flashing like warning sirens. "He was never going to marry you today, Vivienne. He intended to publicly humiliate the Kensington family, sever the ties, and flee to a Volkov safe house in Manhattan. He left you at that altar as a distraction, a lamb tied to a stake while he ran out the back door." Tears of pure, unadulterated rage pricked Vivian's eyes. Preston hadn't just abandoned her. He had actively sacrificed her to buy his own safety. but he underestimated my reach, Caspian continued, leaning forward. The sudden proximity stole the air from Vivian's lungs. He smelled intoxicating like a dark winter storm. I stepped forward, because if I had left you standing there, the Volkovs would have realized you were unprotected. They would have slaughtered you and your parents by nightfall, just to send me a message. So you saved my life, she whispered, her voice cracking. I protected an asset, Caspian corrected, his voice devoid of warmth, though his gaze remained fiercely locked on hers. By claiming you, I have drawn a line in the sand. The Volkovs cannot touch the Queen of the Vain Syndicate without declaring open bloody war on the streets of Boston. Vivienne looked away, staring out at the sun-dappled water of the Charles River. The gilded cage of high society Boston had just shattered, only to reveal a terrifying, violent underworld beneath it. She had traded a cowardly human fiancé for an ancient, ruthless predator. We are approaching the estate, Caspian noted, his eyes scanning the road ahead. When we arrive, you will meet my Seneschal Bastian. He will ensure you have everything you need. But understand this, Vivian, the danger has not passed. Your scent is still entirely human. To the supernatural world, you still smell like prey. How do we change that? She asked, turning back to him. Caspian's gaze dropped to the fragile beating pulse at the base of her throat. A low, barely audible hum vibrated in his chest, a sound born of pure primal hunger. Tonight after sundown, he said softly, his voice a dark caress, we finalize the contract. We seal the blood oath. The Vane estate in Brookline was hidden behind 20-foot wrought iron gates, nestled within 40 acres of dense, centuries-old forest that seemed to absorb the light of the setting sun. As the Maybach rolled up the crushed gravel driveway, Vivian stared in awe at the sheer architectural dominance of the place. It was a sprawling Gothic Revival mansion built from dark slate and granite, featuring towering turrets and ivy-choked walls that looked more like a European fortress than a Massachusetts home. The moment the car stopped, the doors were opened by security personnel dressed in impeccably tailored black suits, all moving with the same unnatural fluid grace that Caspian possessed. A tall man with silver hair at his temples and piercing ice-blue eyes stood at the top of the stone steps. This was Bastian. Welcome home, my lord, Bastian said, bowing his head respectfully to Caspian before turning his crystalline gaze to Vivian. And welcome, Lady Vivian. The staff has prepared the master suite for you. Thank you, Bastian, Caspian said, his tone commanding. Have the perimeter guards doubled. The Volkovs will have heard of the cathedral incident by now. I want a lockdown until the oath is sealed. It is already done, sir. Vivian was escorted through a grand foyer lined with priceless Renaissance art and vaulted ceilings that echoed with their footsteps. The opulence was staggering, far exceeding the fading wealth of her own family's estate. Bastian led her up a sweeping mahogany staircase to the east wing, opening a set of heavy double doors into a suite that was larger than most Manhattan penthouses. Your luggage from your previous living arrangement has not yet arrived, Bastian said, tactfully stepping aside to reveal a massive four-poster bed draped in charcoal silk. However, I have taken the liberty of stocking the wardrobe. There is a hot bath drawn for you in the ensuite. My lord will join you when the sun has completely set. When Bastian left, locking the door behind him with a soft click, Vivian finally let out a ragged breath. She moved to the ensuite bathroom, which was a marvel of black marble and gold fixtures. Peeling off the heavy Vera Wang gown felt like shedding a past life. She let the silk pool on the floor, stepping into the steaming, scented water of the sunken tub. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink, trying to wash away the scent of the cathedral, of Preston's betrayal, and of her own lingering fear. From the wardrobe, she selected a floor-length robe of deep burgundy silk, a subtle nod to her new reality. It clung to her curves, the fabric cold against her feverish skin. She walked over to the massive bay window, looking out over the sprawling estate grounds. The sun had finally vanished below the tree line, plunging the world into a deep, velvety twilight. The estate's exterior lights flickered on, casting long, menacing shadows across the manicured lawns. The heavy bedroom bedroom door opened silently. Vivian spun around. Caspian stood in the doorway. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. His crisp white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. For the first time, he looked less like an untouchable billionaire and more like a predator stalking its territory. "You look beautiful," Caspian said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating in the quiet room. He crossed the distance between them with that terrifying predatory speed. 1 second he was at the door, the next he was standing mere inches from her, trapping her between his solid chest and the bay window. The intense cold radiating from him had vanished, replaced by an intoxicating burning heat that made her breath hitch. "The sun is gone," Caspian murmured, reaching up to tuck a damp lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers traced the line of her jaw. "The time for human rules has passed." "Tell me what this means," Vivian demanded, refusing to break eye contact, though her knees felt weak. "The blood oath. Tell me exactly what you're about to do to me." "I am going to claim you," Caspian answered, his dark eyes locked onto hers with hypnotic intensity. "When a vampire king takes a mortal consort, he must mask her human scent to protect her from other predators. My blood will enter your system. It will heighten your senses, strengthen your immune system, and weave my scent into your very pores. To the Volkovs, you will no longer smell like a vulnerable human girl. You will smell like my territory, untouchable." "And in return," she asked, her voice a fragile whisper, "in return, I take a piece of you," he said, his gaze dropping to the rapid pulse fluttering at the base of her neck. "A willing offering. If you fight me, if the fear in your blood turns sour, the bond will not take. You must accept me, Vivian." Vivian closed her eyes. She thought of Preston cowering on the marble floor. She thought of the Volkov cartel waiting in the shadows to rip her apart. And then she looked at the monster standing before her, a monster who had offered her a crown instead of a cage. She tilted her head back, exposing the long, pale column of her throat. "Do it," she whispered. Caspian let out a low, guttural groan. His hands clamped onto her hips, pulling her flush against his hard body. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. She felt his lips brush against her skin, surprisingly soft before the sharp, precise sting of his fangs pierced her flesh. Vivian gasped, her hands instinctively flying up to grip his broad shoulders. The initial pain was sharp, like a needle prick, but it vanished instantly, replaced by a flood of overwhelming, intoxicating heat. It felt as though he had injected liquid fire directly into her veins. A wave of intense euphoria washed over her, buckling her knees. Caspian held her tight, supporting her entirely as he drank. The sensation was terrifyingly intimate. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beating against her own sinking until they pounded in unison. The world around her blurred the edges of her vision, darkening as the euphoria deepened into a heavy, sensual lethargy. Just as she felt she might pass out, Caspian pulled back. He bit into his own wrist, tearing the skin effortlessly, and pressed his bleeding flesh against her mouth. "Drink," he commanded, his eyes glowing a vibrant, terrifying crimson. "Seal the covenant." Driven by a sudden primal instinct she didn't know she possessed, Vivian opened her mouth and drank. The vampire blood was thick, tasting of copper-dark wine and pure, concentrated energy. The moment she swallowed, the reaction was explosive. Her eyes flew open. The dim bedroom suddenly looked impossibly bright. She could see the microscopic dust motes dancing in the air. She could hear the rustle of the leaves in the forest a mile away, and the steady pacing of the security guards on the ground floor. The lingering fear in her chest evaporated, replaced by a raw, thrumming power. She was no longer just Vivian Kensington, the bankrupt socialite. Caspian released his grip, stepping back to observe her. He wiped a drop of blood from his bottom lip with his thumb, a dark, possessive smile curving his mouth. "Welcome to the syndicate, my queen," Caspian whispered. Suddenly, a loud, violent explosion shattered the quiet night, shaking the very foundations of the mansion. The glass of the bay window rattled violently in its frame. Bastian burst through the bedroom doors, his silver hair disheveled, a matte black tactical rifle in his hands. "My lord," Bastian yelled, his ice-blue eyes wide with urgency. "The perimeter has been breached. The Volkovs are here. They brought fire." Caspian's possessive smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of cold, murderous rage. He looked at Vivian, the newly forged bond humming with electric tension between them. The real war hadn't started at the altar. It was starting right now. The deafening roar of the explosion reverberated through the massive granite foundation of the Brookline estate, rattling the priceless oil paintings in the corridors and sending a violent tremor through the floorboards. The shattered remains of the bay window rained down like crystalline confetti, sparkling in the sudden harsh glare of the security floodlights that swept across the sprawling lawns. Vivian flinched instinctively, throwing her arms over her face, but the expected shower of glass never touched her. Caspian had moved with a speed that defied physics, shielding her body with his own. His broad back absorbed the brunt of the impact, his dark wool trousers and crisp white shirt remaining miraculously unbothered. "Report!" Caspian barked, not to Vivian but to Bastion, who was already keying a sequence into the tactical radio strapped to his Kevlar vest. "They blew the south gate near Goddard Avenue, my lord," Bastion replied, his ice-blue eyes scanning the tree line through the scope of his Heckler & Koch MP5. "It was a shaped C4 charge. They've bypassed the outer electronic countermeasures. We have roughly 40 hostiles advancing through the manicured gardens. They are heavily armed with incendiary rounds and thermal optics. They aren't street thugs. This is a Volkov elite strike team." Caspian's eyes, still glowing a predatory crimson, narrowed into lethal slits. The intoxicating lover, who had just sealed a blood oath with Vivian, vanished entirely, replaced by a ruthless ancient warlord. "They dare to bring fire to my home!" Caspian's voice was a low, terrifying growl that vibrated against Vivian's chest. He pulled away from her, his gaze dropping to her face. He noted the dilation of her pupils, the erratic but powerful thud of her newly enhanced heartbeat. "The bond is fresh, Vivian. Your senses will be overwhelming. Do not let the noise panic you. You belong to me now, and nothing in this world or the next will take you from this room." He reached to the small of his back, drawing a custom Kimber 1911 tactical pistol, the matte black metal absorbing the ambient light. "Bastion, lock the eastern wing. Engage the titanium shutters," Caspian ordered, striding toward the heavy mahogany bedroom doors. "No one breaches the second floor. I will handle the courtyard." "Caspian, wait!" Vivian called out, her voice stronger than she expected. He paused in the doorway, glancing back. "They want me," she said, her heightened senses picking up the distinct smell of burning sulfur and pine needles wafting through the broken window. "Preston sent them to kill me. Preston is a pawn. The Volkovs want a war, and they are using you as the catalyst." Caspian corrected his tone, chillingly calm. "Stay away from the window, my queen. I am going to teach the Russians why the Syndicate owns Boston." With a blur of motion, Caspian and Bastion were gone, the heavy double doors locking with a resounding metallic clank behind them. A second later, heavy titanium shutters slid down over the broken bay window, sealing the room in darkness illuminated only by the soft glow of the ensuite bathroom. Alone in the master suite, Vivian pressed her back against the cool silk of the four-poster bed. She expected to feel terror. She expected to curl into a ball and weep for the life she had lost mere hours ago at the Cathedral of St. Jude. But the terror didn't come. Instead, the vampire blood coursing through her veins acted like a supreme adrenaline cocktail. Her hearing had expanded outward in concentric circles. She could hear the distinct crunch of combat boots on the crushed gravel of the driveway below. She could hear the heavy, frantic breathing of the cartel mercenaries, their heartbeats drumming in a chaotic, synchronized rhythm of anxiety and aggression. And beneath it all, she could hear Caspian. He didn't make a sound when he moved, but she could track his presence by the sudden, terrifying cessation of the heartbeats he encountered. Through the ventilation system, Vivian listened to the massacre. There was the sharp, staccato crack of automatic gunfire, followed instantly by wet, sickening, tearing sounds. Men screamed horrible, ragged sounds that were cut brutally short. She walked toward the sealed window, placing her palm against the cold titanium shutter. She could smell the metallic tang of fresh blood seeping through the air intake. "They are dying," she thought, a strange, detached fascination washing over her. "He is tearing them apart with his bare hands." Down in the courtyard, Caspian Vane was an apex predator unleashed. He moved through the smoke and the strobe-like flashes of muzzle fire like a phantom. A mercenary raised his rifle, only for Caspian to sever his arm at the elbow with a single brutal swipe of a combat blade before driving the Kimber 1911 into the man's chest and pulling the trigger. Caspian didn't flinch as hot blood sprayed across his pristine white shirt. He simply vanished into the shadows again, reappearing behind two more heavily armored men, snapping their necks with a sickening crunch before they could even register his presence. The Volkov strike team had expected heavy resistance from the Syndicate's private security. They had not expected the Vampire King to descend into the dirt and fight them himself. Panic began to ripple through the tactical squad. "Hold the line!" A harsh, thick Russian accent roared over the chaos. "Use the incendiaries! Burn the front doors!" Vivian's eyes snapped open wide. She recognized the proximity of that voice. It wasn't coming from the gardens. It was coming from inside the house. The Volkovs had breached the ground floor. Vivian backed away from the shutters, her enhanced hearing focused downward, piercing through the layers of oak marble and granite that separated the master suite from the grand foyer. Footsteps, heavy tactical boots scuffing against the polished marble floor. There were at least 8 of them moving with coordinated precision. But how Bastian had claimed the electronic countermeasures were state-of-the-art. The reinforced doors of the Vane estate required specific biometric bypasses. They couldn't have simply blasted their way into the main hall without triggering the interior titanium lockdown sequence, unless someone had given them the override codes. "Check the library. Move to the main stairwell," the same gruff Russian voice commanded. It was Dmitry Volkov, the notoriously volatile son of the cartel boss, known in the underworld for his sheer brutality and lack of supernatural restraint. "I gave you the codes. I got you inside," a pathetic, wavering voice cried out. "You said you would let me go. You promised." Vivian's breath hitched in her throat. Her hands curled into tight fists, the perfectly manicured nails biting into her palms. It was Preston. The cowardly Groom hadn't just fled to New York. The Carmichael family's shipping empire owned the subsidiary security firm that had installed the Vane estate's secondary servers 3 years ago. Preston had traded the security layout and the encrypted bypass frequencies to the Volkovs in exchange for his own miserable life. He was the Judas who had unlocked the front door. "Shut up, you sniveling little rat." Dmitri spat, followed by the dull thud of a rifle butt striking bone. Preston whimpered in pain. "You leave when we have the girl, and Vane's head is on a spike." Rage, pure, unadulterated, and distinctly inhuman, flared in Vivian's chest. It was a terrifying, beautiful sensation. The betrayal stung, but the vampire blood in her system mutated that pain into a cold, calculating fury. Preston had left her at the altar, humiliated her family, and now he had brought an army to burn down the only sanctuary she had left. She refused to cower in the bedroom like a helpless damsel. Vivian moved swiftly to the antique armoire near the dressing room. Inside, hidden behind a false panel Bastian had likely intended for Caspian's emergency use, she found a sleek, obsidian-hilted dagger. It was heavier than it looked, perfectly balanced and terrifyingly sharp. She gripped the leather hilt, the cool metal grounding her. She slipped out of the master suite, navigating the darkened upstairs corridor with ease. Her new vision cut through the pitch-black shadows as if it were broad daylight. She moved silently, the heavy silk of her burgundy robe whispering against the floorboards as she reached the top of the sweeping mahogany staircase. Below, the grand foyer was illuminated by the harsh, sweeping beams of the mercenaries' tactical flashlights. Dmitry Volkov stood at the base of the stairs, a massive, scarred brute of a man holding a heavy assault rifle. 2 of his men were forcibly holding Preston Carmichael on his knees. Preston's Tom Ford tuxedo was ruined, covered in dirt and blood, his face bruised and swelling. "Spread out, breach the east wing," Dmitry yelled, pointing his rifle toward the staircase. "I wouldn't advise coming up here," Vivian said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the cavernous acoustics of the foyer, it carried a chilling, authoritative resonance. Every flashlight snapped up to the top of the stairs, catching her in their blinding beams. Vivian didn't blink. She stood tall, the deep burgundy robe framing her figure, the obsidian dagger held loosely at her side. To the Volkovs, she looked like an apparition, a beautiful, untouchable queen looking down upon a pack of feral dogs. Preston gasped, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror. "Vivian, WW, what are you doing? Run!" "Shut your mouth, Preston," Vivian ordered, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. She looked down at him, feeling not a shred of pity. "You brought these animals into my home. You sold my life twice in one day." "Well, well," Dmitri sneered, stepping forward, his rifle aimed squarely at her chest. "The runaway bride, Vane's new little pet. I must say you are much prettier than the photographs. It's a shame we have to put a bullet in that pretty head to send the syndicate a message." "You are trespassing, Dmitri Volkov," Vivian said, leaning slightly against the mahogany banister, feigning a relaxed composure she didn't entirely feel. "And you are sorely misinformed. I am not a pet." Before Dmitri could pull the trigger, the temperature in the foyer violently plummeted. The breath of the mercenaries plumed in the air. The heavy oak front doors, which had been forced open, suddenly slammed shut with a concussive boom that shook the walls. Dmitri spun around, but he was too late. Caspian dropped from the vaulted ceiling like a nightmare made of shadows and malice. He didn't use a gun this time. He landed directly in the center of the squad, his hands wrapping around the throats of the two men holding Preston. With a synchronized, effortless twist, he snapped both their necks, dropping their lifeless bodies to the marble floor. Chaos erupted. The remaining mercenaries opened fire, but Caspian was a blur. The bullets tore through the walls and shattered the Ming vases, but none connected with the Vampire King. Caspian drove his combat blade through the chest of a third man, grabbed a fourth by the tactical vest, and hurled him with monstrous strength entirely across the foyer, smashing him through a marble column. In less than 10 seconds, the elite strike squad was reduced to a pile of broken, bleeding corpses. Only Dmitri and Preston remained. Dmitri, hyperventilating and terrified, raised his rifle to fire at Caspian's back. "Drop it!" a cold voice commanded from behind him. Dmitri froze. Vivian had descended the stairs with unnatural silence. She stood directly behind the cartel heir, the tip of the obsidian dagger pressed firmly against the vulnerable gap between his Kevlar vest and his helmet, resting right against his spinal cord. Caspian slowly turned around. His white shirt was soaked in crimson, his face a terrifying mask of ancient wrath. But as he saw Vivian holding the cartel leader at knife point, a slow, dark smile spread across his lips. "I suggest you listen to my wife, Dmitri," Caspian purred, stepping over a body to approach them. "Her hand is quite steady." Dmitri let the rifle clatter to the floor, raising his hands in surrender. Caspian stepped up to Dmitri, grabbing him by the jaw with a grip that threatened to shatter his skull. "You will go back to New York," Caspian whispered, his voice echoing with demonic power. "You will tell your father that the Brookline estate is sealed in blood. You will tell him that if a single Volkov crosses into Massachusetts again, I will personally travel to Manhattan and burn your empire to the ground. Do you understand?" Dmitri gave a frantic, jerky nod. Caspian released him with a shove, and the cartel heir practically scrambled over his dead men to reach the door, fleeing into the night. The grand foyer fell utterly silent, save for the pathetic, ragged sobbing of the man left kneeling in the center of the room. Preston Carmichael looked up at Vivian, and Caspian, tears streaming down his bruised face. "Vivian, please," he begged, crawling forward on his hands and knees. "They forced me. They said they would kill my family. You have to believe me. We were supposed to be married." Vivian looked down at the man she had almost tethered her life to. She saw the weakness in his eyes, the absolute lack of honor. She lowered the dagger, turning to look at Caspian. The Vampire King stood tall amidst the carnage, his dark eyes locked on her, waiting. He was giving her the power. He was letting her decide the fate of her betrayer. Vivian turned back to Preston, her expression was completely devoid of mercy. "Take him to the cells, Bastian," Vivian commanded, her voice ringing out like a death knell in the quiet hall. "We will decide what to do with the rat tomorrow." The subterranean levels of the Brookline estate were a stark contrast to the Gothic opulence above. There were no Renaissance paintings or mahogany banisters here. It was a labyrinth of reinforced concrete, blinding fluorescent lights, and state-of-the-art soundproofing that felt more like a classified black site than a billionaire's basement. Vivian walked down the long, sterile corridor, the heels of her borrowed stiletto boots clicking rhythmically against the polished epoxy floor. Caspian walked beside her, his presence a dark, suffocating wave of power that caused the armed syndicate guards to avert their eyes and bow their heads as they passed. They reached cell 4. Bastian was already waiting, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. back. He tapped a biometric keycard against the pad, and the heavy steel door slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, Preston Carmichael was huddled in the corner of the small windowless room. He looked pathetic. The heir to a $3 billion maritime logistics empire was trembling on a steel cot, his tailored tuxedo pants torn, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. When he looked up and saw Vivian standing in the doorway, flanked by the Vampire King, he flinched as if he had been struck. "Vivian!" Preston choked out, scrambling to his feet but keeping his back pressed against the concrete wall. "Please! You have to listen to me. You don't know the whole truth." Vivian stepped into the cell. The air was thick with the scent of Preston's terror, sour, sharp, and intensely human. A few hours ago, the smell would have elicited her sympathy. Now, with Caspian's blood thrumming in her veins, it only disgusted her. "I know that you left me at the altar to face a room full of vultures," Vivian said, her voice eerily calm, devoid of the frantic energy that had defined her human life. "I know you sold the security bypass frequencies of this estate to Dmitry Volkov. What other truth could possibly excuse that?" Preston looked at Caspian, his eyes darting frantically. "He knows. Ask him why your father really owed the syndicate money." Vivian paused. She turned her head slightly to look at Caspian. The immortal stood leaning against the steel doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was an unreadable mask of cold marble, but the faint, amused glint in his crimson eyes told her everything. He was letting the rat speak. "Tell me," Vivian commanded, turning her piercing gaze back to her former fiancé. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Your father, Harrison, he didn't embezzle that money to keep up your family's lifestyle. He didn't blow it on the Hamptons house or bad stock portfolios. He used his access to Vane's offshore accounts to buy weapons." Vivian frowned. "Weapons? From Aegis Global," Preston stammered, naming the notorious ultra-classified private military contractor known to operate out of Langley. "They develop experimental high-yield UV pulse emitters, military-grade tech designed to incinerate organic matter at a cellular level. Your father bought 3 of them on the black market." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Her father hadn't just stolen from the Vampire King. He had been plotting an assassination. Harrison knew what Vane was. Preston continued his words, spilling out in a desperate rush. "He wanted to wipe out the syndicate's leadership and seize their real estate assets across New England. But Vane found out about the missing money before the weapons were delivered. Your father panicked. He offered you as collateral to buy himself time to take delivery of the tech." Vivian felt the floor drop out from under her. The betrayal wasn't just Preston's. Her entire life, her wedding, her future, her very body had been used as a meat shield by her own father so he could stage a supernatural coup. "And you?" she asked, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Where did you fit into my father's grand assassination plot?" "I found the shipping manifests," Preston cried. "Carmichael Shipping was supposed to smuggle the emitters into Boston Harbor. When I realized Harrison was going to start a war with the vampires, I knew we would all be slaughtered. I went to the Volkovs to buy my family's safety. I had to Vivi. He was going to get us all killed." Vivian stared at him. The sheer, unadulterated cowardice of the men in her life was staggering. Her father was a treacherous snake, and her fiancé was a spineless traitor. She felt Caspian's cold, heavy hand rest on her shoulder. The touch sent a jolt of grounding electricity through her spine. "The human world is built on deceit, my queen," Caspian murmured softly, his breath brushing her ear. "They smile at dinner parties and slip poison into the wine. They are frail, so they use betrayal as their armor. This is what you have left behind." Vivian looked at Preston, who was now weeping openly, sliding back down the wall to his knees. "What do you want me to do with him?" Caspian asked. "Say the word, Vivian. I will rip his head from his shoulders and send it to his father in a Tiffany box." Preston shrieked, pressing his face into his hands. Vivian looked at the pathetic creature on the floor. Killing him would be easy, but it was too quick. It lacked the poetry of true vengeance. "No," Vivian said smoothly. Caspian's eyebrow arched in surprise. "Death is a release, Caspian. Preston values his wealth and his status above all else. He sold me to protect his empire." She stepped closer to Preston, looking down at him with eyes that had completely lost their human warmth. "Bastian," Vivian called out without looking back. "Yes, Lady Vane," Bastian replied instantly from the hallway. "Draft a contract transferring 70% of the Carmichael Shipping equity to the Vane Syndicate Holding Company. Label it as reparations for the structural damage to the estate tonight, she instructed coldly. If Preston's father refuses to sign it by tomorrow morning, tell him I will personally hand Preston over to Dmitry Volkov. The Russians do not take kindly to informants whose intelligence leads their men into a slaughter. Preston gasped, looking up at her in absolute horror. Vivienne, you can't. That will bankrupt my family. We'll be ruined. You will be exactly what you tried to make me, Vivienne said softly. Penniless, disgraced, and completely at the mercy of monsters. She turned on her heel and walked out of the cell. Caspian followed, a dark, incredibly proud smile spreading across his lips as the heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing Preston in with his own ruin. 3 nights later, a torrential summer thunderstorm lashed against the towering windows of the Kensington family penthouse on Beacon Hill. Inside the lavishly decorated study, Harrison Kensington was frantically stuffing banded stacks of $100 bills, bearer bonds, and a pristine collection of Cartier watches into a leather duffel bag. His hands were shaking so violently, he dropped a velvet box scattering diamond cufflinks across the Persian rug. He had heard the rumors. The underworld was whispering that the Volkov strike team had been entirely decimated at the Brookline estate. Worse, the whispers said that Caspian Vane hadn't killed the Kensington girl. He had turned her. He had crowned her. Harrison knew his time had run out. Aegis Global had delayed the shipment of the UV pulse emitters, spooked by the sudden spike in cartel activity at the harbor. He was defenseless, exposed, and entirely out of options. The heavy oak double doors of the study didn't just open, they shattered inward, the heavy brass locks shearing off completely. Harrison screamed, stumbling backward over his desk, grabbing a silver letter opener in a pathetic display of defense. The storm raged outside, illuminating the doorway with a brilliant flash of lightning. Standing there, arm in arm, were Caspian and Vivienne. Vivienne stepped over the splintered wood. She was breathtaking, draped in a custom Alexander McQueen gown of midnight velvet. Around her throat rested a heavy choker of flawless rubies, a wedding gift from the syndicate. But it was her eyes that made Harrison drop the letter opener. They were no longer the soft hazel eyes of his obedient daughter. They were cold, luminous, and ringed with a terrifying predatory crimson. "Going somewhere, father?" Vivienne asked, her voice echoing with a dark, unnatural resonance that seemed to vibrate the crystal decanters on the bar. "Vivi," Harrison breathed, his face straining of all color. He backed into the bookshelves, his eyes darting between her and the imposing, shadow-draped figure of Caspian Vane. "Vivi, sweetheart, you have to understand. I did it for us. I did it for the family. You sold me to a vampire to cover your embezzlement," Vivienne stated, her tone conversational, yet laced with venom. "And when that wasn't enough, you planned to use military-grade weaponry to assassinate my husband, knowing I would likely be caught in the crossfire." "He's a monster," Harrison yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Caspian, who merely observed the exchange with detached, lethal amusement. "He was bleeding us dry. I was trying to secure our legacy." "Your legacy," Vivienne repeated, stepping closer. The air in the study plummeted to freezing. Frost began to spiderweb across the edges of the windows. "Your legacy is built on cowardice and theft. You are a weak man, Harrison. You played games with gods and expected not to get burned." "Please," Harrison begged, dropping to his knees, his hands clasped together. "I'm your father. I gave you life. And then you priced it, packaged it, and sold it," Vivienne replied coldly. Caspian stepped forward, the shadows seemingly clinging to his tailored suit. "The debt is still outstanding, Kensington. You owe the syndicate $50 million. Your coup failed. Your weapons were intercepted at the docks an hour ago by my men." Harrison let out a broken, hopeless sob. He was cornered. "However," Vivienne interrupted, looking down at the man who had raised her, "I have decided to show you mercy, a trait I assure you my husband did not agree with." Caspian let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sounded like distant thunder. "I would have decorated the Massachusetts Turnpike with his organs, but the Queen is merciful." Vivienne reached into the bodice of her gown and pulled out a folded legal document, tossing it onto the floor at Harrison's knees. "Sign it," she commanded. Harrison looked down. It was a deed of transfer. What is this?" "It is the total forfeiture of the Kensington estate, this penthouse, your offshore accounts." and every remaining asset attached to your name. They now belong to the Vane Syndicate, Vivian explained. Sign it, and you walk out of this penthouse alive. You will have the clothes on your back and the cash in that duffel bag. I suggest you buy a one-way ticket to South America, because if you are still in Boston by sunrise, the Volkovs will find you. And they are very upset about what happened to their strike team. Harrison looked at his daughter. He saw no hesitation, no residual love, no weakness. She was entirely lost to him. She was a creature of the night now, an apex predator sitting upon a throne of blood and shadows. With a trembling hand, Harrison reached into his jacket, pulled out a Mont Blanc pen, and signed his life away. He didn't say another word. He grabbed the duffel bag, scrambled to his feet, and practically ran out of the shattered doors, fleeing into the stormy night. Vivian stood in the center of the quiet study. The heavy burden of her past, the expectations of high society, the manipulation of her family, it was all gone. Caspian stepped up behind her. He wrapped his strong, cold arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply, his lips brushing against the fading twin puncture marks he had left there 3 nights ago. "You were magnificent," Caspian murmured, his voice a dark, intoxicating purr. Vivian leaned her head back against his shoulder, looking out the window at the glittering, rain-slicked skyline of Boston. It was no longer a city that dictated her worth. It was a city she now owned. "He was right about one thing," Vivian whispered, turning her head slightly to capture Caspian's lips in a deep, bruising kiss that tasted of power and eternity. "Oh," Caspian asked against her mouth, a dangerous smile curving his lips. "And what was that?" Vivian pulled back just enough to look into his crimson eyes. "You are a monster, but fortunately for you, so am I." Together, the king and queen of the syndicate turned off the lights in the ruined penthouse, leaving the human world behind, and stepped seamlessly into the shadows. Did Vivian make the right choice, trading a mortal coward for a vampire king? Sometimes the greatest villains wear tailored tuxedos, and the real protectors hide in the shadows. If you were captivated by Vivian's dark transformation and Caspian's ruthless devotion, you won't want to miss our next story. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow dark romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were left at the altar? Until next time, stay in the shadows.